Well, welcome to the Harold B. Lee Library's House of Learning Lecture Series. I'm Mike Hunter, the coordinator for the lecture series this year. In section 88, verse 119 of the Doctrine and Covenants, it says, "Organize yourselves and establish a house, even a house of faith, a house of learning." As a repository for all academic disciplines on campus, the Harold B. Lee Library lies at the heart of campus and seeks here to establish a house of learning through these lecture series, which brings together scholars from all academic disciplines and students in a discussion of ideas. In association with the opening of the new exhibit in the Lee Library, we are privileged to have as our featured speaker today Professor John Telford from BYU's Department of Visual Arts, Tom Wells, curator of photographic archives in the L. Tom Perry Special Collections, and the curator of this beautiful exhibit that you'll see at the end of the lecture, will introduce both the exhibit and Professor Telford at this time.
It is with great pleasure today that I officially open the Harold B. Lee Library's exhibit titled From Daguerreotype to Digital, celebrating 170 years of photography, as well as introduce today's speaker, Professor John Telford. 170 years ago, on August 19, 1839, the daguerreotype was presented to the world and photography was born. This event was preceded by decades of research and experimentation and followed by never-ending quest to discover new and better methods of creating images. This exhibit attempts to help us understand the evolution of photography and the mysteries and wonders it holds. One enters the exhibit by passing through the recreation of an early 1900s photo studio, thus symbolically going back in time. The first image you see is the daguerreotype of Brigham Young. By reading the explanations of each process, you can learn the many different ways photographs were made as they evolved from the daguerreotype to the digital images of today. Every description is illustrated with items from the L. Tom Perry Special Collections. Photographs and artifacts were selected that demonstrate the vastness of our holdings and include the images of historical personalities and events, as well as original works of notable photographers like William Henry Jackson, Edward Curtis, C.R. Savage, Alfred Stieglitz, and Ansel Adams. There is even a beautiful modern print of George Edward Anderson's 1907 glass plate negative of the Sacred Grove, made by our very own John Telford. It is only fitting that the opening of this exhibit be accompanied by a lecture given by Professor Telford, a distinguished photographer himself. John is a native of Utah and has been making photographs of the landscape and the environment for nearly 40 years. His photographs have been published extensively, including over 50 cover photographs, and exhibited both nationally and internationally, and are included in numerous public and private collections, such as the International Center of Photography in New York City, the New York Public Library, and the New York City Museum, the Milwaukee Art Center, and the Jersey City Art Museum, the National Wildlife Museum and Art in Jackson, Wyoming, and the Salt Lake City International Airport, just to mention a few. John has authored and co-authored 17 books, including the Great Salt Lake Portfolio, with foreword by Pulitzer Prize winner Wallace Stegner. John received an MFA from the University of Utah and is a professor here at Brigham Young University. John is loved and respected by the students he teaches. Among other courses, John has taught the history of photography for many years. John has also served as chair of the Department of Visual Arts. John recently won the prestigious Carl G. Mazur Award for Creative Excellence and has won numerous other awards and honors throughout the country. John was also the subject of a recent documentary, Quality of Light, the photography of John Telford. Professor Telford's lecture today is titled, The Evolution of Photographic Vision, Photography's Love-Hate Relationship with Sharpness. Professor Telford.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be invited to give this House of Learning lecture. This topic, the evolution of photographic vision, is something that I teach when I'm doing the history of photography, and takes 16 weeks to get through. I'm going to see if I can do it in about 45 minutes. We'll see how far we can go. In 1558, Giovanni Battista della Porta first described the camera obscura, a device used for making pictures. Now, this is significant to me because a full 300 years, or nearly 300 years before the actual invention of photography, the camera was being used by artists to make pictures, drawings, paintings, etchings, various forms of visual art. Knowing that, it's important for us to realize that the standards, the criteria, the rules about making pictures were well in place when photography was actually invented. And the inventors of photography did not consider that they had created a totally new and unique medium, but rather simply a medium that they were able to do manually, or rather automatically through the agency of light, what they had been doing manually for 300 years before. One of the things that is included in his description of the camera obscura is this line: anyone ignorant of the art of painting can use the camera to draw with a pencil or pen the image of anything whatsoever. I find that interesting. We as photographers who use the camera are considered by Della Porta as ignorant of the art of painting. Today, 170 years after the introduction of photography, the invention of photography, if you will, photography is the ubiquitous, quintessential medium of the 20th century, and as we look now into the 21st century, we see that it is staying right along with that. As described, the daguerreotype, introduced in August of 1839 to the world, falls into two different categories. The daguerreotype falls into what we refer to as the established criteria and also the vernacular criteria. This particular photograph of a daguerreotype falls into that category we call vernacular, characterized by the fact that the soldier in this particular photograph is looking right into the camera, evenly illuminated. There are bits of gold leaf that are added to the picture, to the daguerreotype, because color was not available. Color had not been invented and would not be for another 100 years. It's in the classic case, the Encased Daguerreotype. It is a photograph made on highly polished copper plate. The image is in reverse, meaning that laterally it is the mirror image of what was actually before the camera. So the officer in this particular case appears to be left-handed, something that I am naturally, and I gravitate to people who are left-handed. But in actuality, he'd be right-handed in this picture. At that same time, the team of Southworth and Hawes were creating established criteria daguerreotypes. The established meaning that they were following the standards of Renaissance painting and drawing. You see chiaroscuro lighting quality that is used here that is quite remarkable. The daguerreotype was known as a medium of very high quality detail sharpness, tonality, all of those aspects that become an important element in photography today. And as I've titled this lecture, The Love-Hate Relationship of Sharpness that Photography has experienced over its entire history, this happens to be one of those first things that when photography was first invented, it touted the quality of being sharp and detailed and fine tonality, as exhibited in both this photograph of Josiah Johnson Hawes and the photograph of the officer. This is a good example of the vernacular that we talk about. The young boy seated in a chair, looking right into the camera, happy to have his picture taken. Also, you see the added color, the color that's added to the daguerreotype to compensate for the fact that it was not there. This falling into the vernacular aspect of the daguerreotype. Now, these two differences, the established and vernacular, the historians have supposed or proposed that two possible reasons for this difference occur. One, the itinerant photographers that picked up daguerreotyping probably were not educated in the arts. And out of ignorance, they started making photographs that didn't apply any of the rules of how to make a photograph. The other supposition is that they simply ignored those rules in an effort to try to break away from the established approaches and try to establish some sort of a medium that was unique. I love this picture of Sam. You know it's Sam because he's pointing in his belt buckle to his name. In this particular case, Sam is well aware that the daguerreotype would render things laterally reversed, because as you look at that belt buckle, you realize that his name is made up of hand-set type, which is in its own right laterally reversed. But in the daguerreotype, it is right reading. And now we know this is Sam, Samuel Clemens, who later became Mark Twain. The other process that is remarkable at this particular time, also introduced in 1839, is the process done by William Henry Fox Talbot. Fox Talbot made photographs on paper negatives. In other words, he coated the paper with silver nitrate, placed that into the camera obscura, and exposed it to light, creating a negative, what we refer to today as a negative. The solution for that negative was simply to coat another piece of paper, expose that piece of paper to the negative or the in-camera image, and make a positive. This is significant because this is the form of photography that we have followed for the better part of the 170 years of its history, the negative-positive aspect. Also important with this consideration is the fact that with the negative, a one-of-a-kind, any number of prints could be made. So early in its history, photography becomes a print-making process. While daguerreotyping was very popular, particularly as a portrait medium, it was unable to make multiple copies from that original. Each daguerreotype is an original. It is not a copy unless it is copied as a daguerreotype. In this particular process, the qualities found in a daguerreotype in terms of its sharpness and tonality and detail are somewhat missing. Even though in this particular photograph of the open door, Talbot used this photograph as one of many that he included in a book published, the first book published with photographs, called The Pencil of Nature. In it, Talbot says, "An artist would not have taken the trouble to copy faithfully from nature all the minute details shown in the picture, and would content himself with general effect." In this particular case, we see a fair amount of detail, but we don't see the same degree of detail that you see in a daguerreotype. The contrast is harsh. The detail in the broom are there, but they're not as finely articulated as it is in the daguerreotype. The doorway is open, but does not give us the sense of substance that is in those shadow areas. The highlights are too bright, and it's contrasty. It has deficiencies. Hill and Adamson, a team of Scottish photographers, capitalized on these deficiencies in making photographs that fell into the category of being suggestive, unarticulated, capitalizing on the effects rather than the actual detail that would be rendered in the photograph. In that discussion, David Octavius Hill made the following statement. The rough surface and unequal texture throughout the paper, remember this is a paper negative in which he's making a print, so we're printing through the paper. The unequal texture throughout the paper is the main cause for the calotypes failing in detail before the process of daguerreotyping. And this is the very life of it, he adds. They look more like the imperfect work of man and not the much diminished perfect work of God. So this argument begins in the very beginnings of photography. The rationale or the discussion between sharpness and suggestion, articulation versus effect. This whole argument, which has been repeated over and over again through the history of photography, and that argument that I'll try to demonstrate as we go on. John Henning and his female audience, also a Hill and Adamson photograph. The life study of George Bell. Again, we realize looking at this photograph, this is not a portrait of George Bell, but rather, as the title suggests, a life study in which George Bell is the subject. We're looking at human form as opposed to a portrait of George Bell. We see the effect, we see the softness, we see the tonality as being unarticulated and effective. Photographers who used the daguerreotype typically did portraits. However, photographers who went out into the world to photograph the ancient monuments, the architectural monuments, the things that would be worthy of the world's attention, chose to use the calotype process or processes that followed that particular process because of the ability to make multiple prints. So in this particular case, Maxime Duchamp goes to Egypt and uses the calotype process in making these photographs of the Egyptian monuments. Francis Frith also goes to Egypt to photograph the pyramids in Egypt. I think it's interesting to point out in this picture the use of space and how he is actually making this photograph. While there are figures in the photograph, and while those figures show somewhat of a scale, when we look at the use of space, the foreground is rather uninviting, uninteresting. The sky is blank. And we see a typical approach that early photographers use of simply getting far away from the objects that they photograph so that they can include them in their entirety in the frame of the photograph. In the 1850s, advances are being made in the printmaking process to achieve more sharpness. In actual practice, the photographers are trying to achieve more sharpness. So in this particular photograph by Blanchard-Evrard, he uses what is referred to as dilute albumin to bring the silver nitrate right to the surface of the paper, which makes it appear sharper. Now, one of the interesting things about that is that this surface puts a little bit of a sheen, a little bit of a gloss onto the paper, which early critics referred to as vulgar varnish, because it didn't look as pure as the etchings and the prints that they were used to. Now, vulgar at that particular time means common. It's not not quite the same terminology the way we use it today. But it's interesting that critics criticized the use of that albumin, egg white. In 1850, Frederick Scott Archer invents what is called the Wet Collodion Process, a very elaborate, very difficult process that requires a glass plate. That's the first thing, is it's made on glass for transparency, for sharpness. It has a glass plate that is coated with a collodion solution, which is then also coated with silver nitrate. The process had to be done. The glass is coated, exposed in the camera, and processed before the image could dry, requiring then that the photographer also have a darkroom. It's an elaborate, difficult process, but one chosen and becomes the major process of the 19th century because of the sharpness associated with that image. Spin-off processes of that particular time include the ambrotype, which is a portrait medium referred to sometimes as a poor man's daguerreotype, in which, again, there's an image on glass. As you see on the left-hand side of the frame, the image is in negative form, but when black paper or fabric is placed behind it, it appears to be positive. It would still be a one of a kind rather than using this very thin negative to make prints from. The Tintype is also a variation of that process. But this process introduced the ability to make multiple prints, but as exhibited here, this is an uncut carte de visite of Princess Gabrielle Bonaparte. The carte de visite is a small print, approximately wallet size, if you will, the size of a credit card or this wallet size. And I point that out because this becomes a standard size that we continue to use today. Closely associated with that in time is also a process or a print called the cabinet card, a print that is approximately 4 by 6 inches. And again, a size that is also standard today. This print being a little bit larger, a little bit closer to the subject, more detail, more sharpness than was possible in the preceding processes, also revealed the imperfections of the face. Because, as you know, we from time to time have acne problems or other little deficiencies in our face. When we get that much detail and that close to a subject, the art of retouching was also invented at this particular time. So in this particular case, her face is smooth and beautiful and ivory-like because of the artist or the ability to retouch. Stereo cards were also introduced at about this time. The stereo card became the equivalent of television today. This is what people would use as entertainment. If you had a date, you brought your beau over to the house and you sat in the parlor and pulled out stereo cards and enjoyed reading about the various places in the world. In this particular case, the Brooklyn Bridge. But your parlor would include probably hundreds of these with the unique stereo viewers to give you the impression of looking at three-dimensionality. This also creates a whole industry of photography. There's the photographer, there's the publisher, there are the printmakers, the photo finishers, and there's a class of laborers that assemble all of these. Now, with that in mind, we see standardization coming into photography. Large quantities of prints being made. At one particular point, it was stated that 30% of the egg production in Great Britain was going to the production of albumin for albumin prints. So it becomes a very popular medium, but also becomes standardized in the way it's being approached. The artists of the time, the photographic artists, wanted to break away from standardization. So this example of Etienne Cargier's photograph of Charles Baudelaire. I have two images of this particular photograph. This one, which is an albumin print, and this one that is a carbon print. Careful inspection will reveal that they're made from the same negative. One is reversed, that's true. The carbon print is a transfer process, and so it would transfer the print over to another form, reversing its imagery. But in the carbon print, you'll notice along the bottom part, the edges are darkened, the pocket on his coat has been removed or suppressed, and it has a much more artistic sense to it than does the albumen print. Another photographer of the time is Julia Margaret Cameron, who also used the Wet Collodion process in making portraits mostly of neighbors, of domestic help, people that she was familiar with. She made literary type photographs, the example of which is the title of this photograph, a carbon print, by the way. Call, I follow, let me die. And then this is simply Pomona, an albumen print made from a wet collodion negative. Following the Renaissance and Victorian standards of picture making, this photograph by Samuel Bourne is a good example of the use of space. We have a dark foreground with these individuals in the boat. It has a beautiful reflection of the palace on this lake in India. It works its way up to the top and uses the space very effectively. But everything in the photograph is contained within that frame. This is a problem that photographers dealt with very early on. The painters had an easy time to be able to use elements on the edges of the frame to confine the viewer into the picture or eliminate distracting things on the edges. The photographers struggled with that. In most cases, it was solved by simply getting a far distance away from what was being photographed and include all of the edges. But in other instances, it was just simply impossible. So while the photographer, in this particular case, Albert Collard, stands a far distance from these ivy-covered archways, the photograph, while it reveals what these archways look like, is not very inviting in the sense of visual elements. The foreground is empty. It doesn't have any visual interest in it. The sky is empty. A classic example of what wet collodion does to a blue sky, renders it white. And we have this row of archways that in any other form is rather a boring photograph. Roger Fenton solves this problem to a certain degree in this photograph of the Ribble by using the river as a visual element, giving a somewhat semicircle in the photograph. But the problem of sky is solved to a small degree by simply cutting a radial corner into the upper part. If you eliminate some of that sky in the print, it's not going to be quite so distracting. But this becomes a problem that photographers deal with early on. How does the photographer maintain control of the edges, keeping the viewer into the picture itself? In this particular case, Fenton gets a distance from the church, the Salisbury Cathedral, and uses the trees on the edges the way a painter would use the trees on the edges to suppress detail and maintain the viewer into the center. He continues, as you see here, to use the rounded corners. In this particular case, he uses the tool of a bullseye or a target in the center of the photograph, in the case of the tree, to maintain the viewer into the center of the photograph. Charles Marville solves the problem by not really solving the problem, but simply articulating that the world goes beyond the edges of the photographic frame. Rather than trying to suppress it, rather than trying to bring detail in to hide the edges, he simply points out that the edges of the photograph represent the edge of the photograph, and the world goes on beyond that. It's something we don't think about too much today, but it is a photographic standard that has been accepted and unchallenged as we move forward. So in this particular case also, Charles Marville, we have what could be appear extraneous elements coming in from the edges of the photograph, which we simply agree to not be concerned about it. the world goes on outside of that frame. In this particular photograph, we see the elements of the dark edges that are able to contain the detail of these arches in this particular bridge. The reflection works well to fill the foreground. Ancient subjects or historic subjects are treated the way painters and printmakers had been treating those subjects for the previous several hundred years. But with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, we see subject matter that has never been seen before. Photographers are able to photograph these elements in a new and exciting way because they simply had not been seen before. So in this particular case, Edouard Vuillard photographs the train depot, utilizing the tracks of the train to create a dynamics, leading the eye right into the train station. In fact, right on through to the trains that are on the other side. Gustav Legrand revolutionizes the way that we see things by finding an elevated view. He looks down at the railroad yard. He uses the railroad tracks in this particular case as diagonal lines, converging toward the lower right-hand corner. In his elevated view, he also elevates the horizon line. Rather than showing a lot of sky, he solves the problem of wet collodion in this particular case by simply eliminating sky and creating a much more dynamic composition in this particular instance. The bridges that are made out of steel, again, this is new Industrial Revolution engineering. Undoubtedly, the engineers want to show this superstructure of the bridge. So instructing the photographer to photograph it from the underneath side. But as the photographer goes to the underneath side and photographs the bridge, the dynamics of this picture are much stronger. As we look at the lines coming from the center of the photograph, proceeding out on the edges, all along the top, there's a dynamics to this. Albert Collard made this photograph. Remember, Albert Collard is the one who made the vapid photograph of the archways, the ivy-covered archways that I showed you a bit ago. Now Albert Collard makes a much stronger photograph as he gets underneath this bridge, allowing these lines to proceed right out of the corner of the photograph, but the dynamics have increased and become much stronger. Robert Hollett photographs the Leviathan, the Great Eastern steamship, that is made out of steel. Rather than standing back and photographing the entire ship, he photographs a portion of the hull, filling the frame with that hull, making it appear larger than it would if he were to stand back and photograph the entire thing. And he also includes a couple of people to give a size relationship. Here, Hollett photographs the designer of the Great Eastern, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, in front of the anchor chains. Also a comparison of the size and the immensity of this incredible ship. In the late 1880s, early 1890s, George Eastman received several patents related to handheld cameras and roll film. It's interesting that the historians Helmut and Alison Gersheim criticize Eastman with this comment, that George Eastman was solely responsible for the death of serious photography. This particular photograph, I think, could be used as Exhibit A to prove that to be true. However, we have to realize that George Eastman redefines what the camera is and who the photographer is. While photography had been utilized by a select few, if you will, suddenly with this Eastman Kodak camera, photography is put into the hands of literally everyone. In this particular case, the subject matter becomes an intimate relationship of family members, standing in front of a fence or some other thing, celebrating some kind of an event of some sort. If you note carefully, there's actually 5 people in this photograph. There's 2 men, two women and there's a shadow from the photographer, because the rule is that you have the light coming over your left-hand shoulder when you use the Kodak camera. This photograph by Edouard Vuillard, I think, is also exemplary of this concept of the handheld camera. Vuillard is there, of course, making this picture. The sitters in this picture know that he's there. He's a close family member or a friend in this particular environment. But there's a casualness to this that we don't see in previous photographs. The people are casually conversing, unaware or at least uncaring that Vuillard is there with a camera. The third individual, his legs coming in from the edges, also is an exemplary of the casualness and the randomness of the way the camera is used at this particular time. Another casual gathering of friends, photographed here by Edgar De Gah. I find it interesting that De Gah was a photographer as well as a painter. Knowing that he was dealing with photography means that he also was aware of the dilemma of the edges and what goes on the edges of the photographic frame. And Marville's explanation that the world goes on beyond the confines of the photographic frame. So when we see paintings like this of Edgar De Gah, we understand that this is the influence of photography on his painting. The ballerina is cut off on the right-hand side halfway through. The staircase on the left-hand side. We have legs coming down the stairs, coming out of the edges of the frame. The center is a casual rehearsal of a ballerina's. And we understand that this is the influence of photography on Edgar De Gah. A 9-year-old Jacques-Louis Lartigue, Jacques-Henri Lartigue. I love this picture. Lartigue borrowed his father's camera, set it on a plank that was set across the tub, and you see the glee in his face as he anticipates the making of this particular photograph. And I wonder also if there's just a certain degree of guilt, because we know how children borrow things. The father probably had no idea that his camera was being subjected to a disastrous situation. Lartigue continues to make photographs through his entire life with this boyish attitude, this boyish concept. He captures people in midair, suspending them there for a lifetime. He photographs people in unusual situations. He photographs his racing cars. This casualness would be impossible without the inventions of George Eastman and the hand camera. Returning a little bit to Gustav Legrand and the problems that were encountered with Wet Collodion and the white skies. Gustav Legrand solved this problem simply by making multiple negatives. He would make one negative for the ground or the land and make another negative for the sky, the clouds, and then combine those in printing to create photographs like this and like this, with the idea that photographers could use multiple negatives to render what was in their creative intent. Henry Peach Robinson began making photographs that incorporated several negatives. It was an artistic approach, an effort to regain some of the artistic qualities that photographers were losing. So in this particular photograph, we can just dissect this and look at the various elements. This is one element from this photograph called Fading Away, in which 5 different negatives are combined in printing to create this photograph. 100 years later, Jerry Uelsman, a photographer from Florida, also incorporated some of these ideas in this photograph, a self-portrait called Homage to Henry Peach Robinson, in which he satirically incorporates this multiple negative aspect. In this particular photograph, again, multiple negatives are used to render his creative intent. He being able to use a darkroom that had 7 enlargers in it to create these photographs. In today's world, of course, we do this in the computer with digital means. Jerry Ullsman was doing this with analog silver gelatin prints in a darkroom, rendering these incredible prints. At this particular time, 1889, Emerson writes a book called Naturalistic Photography for Students of the Arts. In it, he criticizes Henry Peach Robinson's use of multiple negatives in making prints, and feels that the photograph should be straight, and that's the terminology he uses. I look at his prints, and the concept that I have for straight is obviously different than the concept that he had for straight. For as we look at this particular print, which is an albumen print, and then the photogravure that follows it, we see that he's, number one, eliminated the trees on the right, and number two, where there's a blank sky, he puts clouds in this picture through the use of the photogravure process. We also see the increase in contrast in the farmer's coat, lines around him that create a little bit of an artistic quality. There's a softness to this image. There's effect. There's atmosphere. And as Peter Henry Emerson publishes this book, the advent of pictorialism comes into being. Pictorialism is coincident in photography with impressionism in painting, and has many of the same qualities. It's about atmosphere, effect, weathers, light, these qualities that we see in this particular photograph by George Seekey, the Misty Pond, a gum bichromate print. The pictorialists, by the way, made prints of very, very difficult processes, partly out of a rebellion against the Kodak Sunday snap shooters, who had the ability to simply send their film to Kodak with the attitude that you press the button, we'll do the rest. These artists of the pictorialist era wanted to make photographs that the Sunday snap shooters simply could not make. So they make very difficult alternative processes that our students are working on today. George Einbeck's The Swan. Robert de Marché, a Rollins oil portrait of the woman. Edward Steichen's The Pond, a platinum print with gum bichromate overprinted on it. And Edward Steichen's The Flatiron, also a platinum print with gum bichromate printed over it. Alfred Stieglitz, who was a very active pictorialist, rebels against pictorialism in about 1905 and takes his following and creates the New York Photo Secession. In it, he feels that the subject matter of the pictorialist was limiting. I've referred to it as photographing the 3 F's: farms, fields, and females. And that's what they seem to focus on. Stieglitz felt that there needed to be a broader subject matter. So the previous photograph by Steichen is actually one that he does as part of the secession of photographing the new architecture in New York, the steel-based skyscrapers, the things that are going on which represent the Industrial Revolution, rather than celebrating the bucolic past. Stieglitz then works toward, as we see in his photographs, a sharper rendition than what was going on with the pictorialists. This photograph, called the Steerage, done with a hand camera, done as a photograph that is a statement about the qualities of people making the passage from Europe to America, the rich people being able to do it in the upper class, upper decks, and the poor people doing it in the steerage areas of the ship. So it's called the Steerage. Stieglitz also photographed again, the architecture photographed at night. But in this particular case, it was influenced by the Cubists, and he makes Cubist photographs. I could also point out that you'll notice the window in kind of the center of the photograph has a flaring out quality. Any of you who are familiar with Georgia O'Keeffe's paintings of the city also see the use of this flaring that she incorporates into her paintings, something that she learned from her husband, Alfred Stieglitz. And here, as I point out, Stieglitz promoted, fell in love with, married Georgia O'Keeffe. Edward Weston's photographs. As we leave the pictorialist era of softness and atmosphere, there is a return to this quality of sharpness. Edward Weston, who was also a pictorialist, abandons the sharpness or the pictorialist standards and adopts the use of gelatin silver prints, glossy prints, a large format camera, 8x10 for the most part, contact prints to create images of impeccable sharpness. Weston, as you see in this photograph, is also a modernist formal photographer, meaning that the photographs are about the elements of art and the principles of design. We have the elements of line and shape and texture and value that become more important than simply the underneath side of a sink in Mexico. His sand dunes in Oceano is also an example of these formalist qualities. His friend and neighbor Ansel Adams also was a pictorialist at one point, but adopted this quality of sharpness in his photographs, making photographs, again, from large format cameras, dealing with the concepts of light, value, texture, these elements, as we see in this photograph of Lone Pine, where there's light at the bottom, and then dark, and then light, and then dark, in horizontal bands in this photograph. Or this photograph, Mount Williamson, with the rocks in the foreground, a near-far relationship, divided into thirds as we use the academic concepts or principles. It's interesting to note that both Ansel Adams and Edward Weston never talked about these modernist formal qualities. In fact, Ansel would say he had no idea what they all meant. But intuitively, he made photographs that fell into these formalist qualities. Another Ansel Adams photograph, the woman behind the screen door. Critics of Ansel Adams would frequently say, when he photographs people, they look like rocks. But then one of his defenders said, yeah, but when he photographs rocks, they look like people. At about the same time Ansel Adams is making his monumental photographs of the landscape, Robert Frank, a Swiss-born photographer, is going around America documenting post-war America and showing a side of America to Americans, which is a little bit startling, but iconic at the same time. His photographs fall into this category of being a little bit softer, a little bit more gritty in the sense of the way he's using the 35 millimeter camera as opposed to the big camera. As he goes throughout America, photographing Americans, post-war veteran, amputee, the jukebox, iconic in 1950s life, Robert Frank. Robert Adams makes photographs of the landscape that fall into the category of new topographics. Robert Adams, who's not a relative of Ansel Adams, made this photograph, which appears a little bit more 19th century, if you will, with the tonality that is there. It's beautiful in that sense, but as we look at this photograph, look closely at the shoreline of the Missouri River going through South Dakota, we see that it's strewn with trash, with cans that are left there. So the new topographic photographers come into photography making statements about what man has done to the environment, as opposed to the way Ansel Adams did it by not acknowledging that man ever existed on the planet. Suburbia, as seen through the lens of Robert Adams. Another new topographic photographer, John Fall, makes this photograph in an idealistic light quality, beautiful in the sense of this sunset, this beautiful quality of light, hoping that when you see the nuclear power plant, the cooling towers that are in this photograph, that you'll say something's out of place, something's not quite right. Roger Minnick makes photographs of the national parks, again, a mainstay of Ansel Adams, but showing us the national parks the way we probably see them more often than the way Ansel ever saw them. Chuck Close uses an 8x10 Polaroid cameras to create this montage, this collage, that is informed probably by the artists of the time that do photographic type paintings, photorealism. David Hockney also uses the collage approach in making this photograph called Pear Blossom Highway, on which several hundred 3x5 prints are puzzled together to create this image of the Pear Blossom Highway that in reality doesn't even exist. We are now in the first decade, if you will, of serious digital photography. With the advent of the digital camera, the camera now has been placed in all citizens of the world, as depicted in this photograph of a native in Vanuatu making digital photographs. I find it interesting that in this context, the digital photography, of course, is being used in a number of different ways. But one of the ways that it is used very strongly at this particular point is a reference back to Henry Peach Robinson and then Jerry Uelsmann, where the camera is used not as a capture device the way I use it, as I refer to myself as a hunter-gatherer, but rather as a sketchbook, to pull from elements and subsequently put them together to create images that in reality never existed. This is an example of a John Lund photograph in which he went to Thailand to photograph a couple of elephants held by a trainer. And as he's working with these elephants, making several, probably hundreds of photographs, and then taking elements of those and putting them together to create this elephant stampede that in reality never happened. I love this particular photograph by Gregorio Kolbert. And one of the things I like about it is the use of material to print on. In this particular case, he's not subjected or not limited by photographic paper, but rather prints on incredibly large sheets of rice paper or art paper, and then put on an exhibit in what's called the Nomad Museum, which to me was a very interesting approach using the digital ability, the digital photography. Nick Brandt also, starting with film, but including prints made on several different types of print material, expanding the ability of the photograph beyond the limitations of the simple photographic papers that are available, also in this particular case. Glenn Wexler, also taking elements out of his sketchbook of camera and utilizing those to create this photograph. And then finally, my colleague Paul Adams made this photograph of a pier in Key West, Florida. Elements that are brought from multiple images to put this, what appears to be a very realistic photograph, but in actuality is a creation that comes from his creative mind. I think that's the important thing that we look at as we look at the advent of digital photography. I am one who I said is stuck in this concept of being hunter-gatherer. I find the photographs that are already in existence. Today's photographer utilizing the digital realm is able to take the images, use them as a sketchbook, and then create photographs from their minds that in reality don't exist. And as we look at the advent of photography in the future, one of the things that I've thought about is that we are repeating what went on 170 years ago by the inventors of photography. They invented a medium to try to mimic painting and drawing. Today's world, at least 10 years ago, as we initially started doing digital photography, it seemed that we were doing a new medium to try to mimic what photography was already doing very, very well. But this is a new medium and should find its own road and its own aesthetics and its own standards to be the new medium that I think it is. Thank you very much.